The cicadas were singing their late summer song when I found myself gripping the chain-link fence so tightly that the metal left impressions in my palms. The track stretched out before me, a perfect oval of worn asphalt that had seen thousands of races, thousands of dreams either realized or shattered in the space of a few hundred meters. The stands were maybe half full, if I was being generous. Parents scattered across the bleachers, some scrolling through their phones, others calling out encouragement to teenagers whose names they probably couldn't pronounce correctly. I was there for my son, David, 16 years old and all legs and lungs, the way I used to be, the way I thought I'd forgotten how to be. He was in lane 4, crouched low at the starting line, his fingers pressed against the warm asphalt. Even from where I stood, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set with that particular kind of determination that only comes when you're young enough to believe that running fast enough might actually change something fundamental about who you are. The starter raised his pistol, and the world went quiet except for the drone of insects in the trees beyond the field. That moment before the gun fires has always felt sacred to me. All that potential energy, coiled and waiting. Bodies prepared to explode into motion. Hearts beating so hard they might burst. The crack of the starting pistol split the evening air, and they were off. 8 boys becoming one fluid motion of pumping arms and driving legs. I watched David settle into 4th place as they rounded the first turn, his stride long and easy. He had good form, better than mine had been at his age. I found myself leaning forward, my knuckles white against the fence, willing him to find that extra gear, that place beyond effort where the body stops thinking and just runs. But as the rhythmic pounding of sneakers against asphalt filled my ears, as the sound of straining lungs and whispered prayers drifted across the infield, my mind began to drift. Not to David's race, though I could still see him there in my peripheral vision, moving up to 3rd place now. No, my thoughts were pulled backward, across decades, to another track, another race, another boy whose lungs burned with the same desperate fire. The memory came like a physical blow. 23 years old again, my legs like pistons, my heart hammering against my ribs as I pushed through the final turn of the most important race of my college career. And beside me, stride for stride, was Elias Carter. Dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, green eyes fixed on the finish line ahead, his breathing ragged but controlled. We had pushed each other to that place beyond exhaustion, beyond rational thought, where only will remain. The homestretch had felt endless. Every step was agony, but I couldn't let him win. Not Elias. Not after everything we had been to each other, though neither of us had ever been brave enough to name what that was. We hit the tape together, both of us stumbling forward, gasping, our legs finally giving out beneath us. And then, in that moment when the world was spinning and my vision was white at the edges, he had turned to me. His face was inches from mine, sweat dripping onto the track between us, and he leaned in and pressed his lips to mine. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, maybe less, just long enough for me to taste salt and exhaustion and something deeper, something that made my chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with running. Then we both collapsed onto the warm asphalt, breathing too hard to speak, too stunned to look at each other. The officials were calling out times, coaches were shouting, teammates were slapping our backs, but all I could feel was the ghost of his mouth against mine and the terrible, wonderful weight of what had just happened. A cheer from the stands yanked me back to the present. David was coming around the final turn in 2nd place, his face a mask of concentration and pain that I recognized too well. I forced myself to clap, to shout his name, to be the father I was supposed to be. But my hands were shaking, and my throat felt raw, as if I had been the one running. The truth was awake again. After all these years of careful forgetting, of building a life that looked exactly like what everyone expected it to look like, that kiss was suddenly as real and immediate as the humid evening air around me. Elias Carter, the name I hadn't spoken aloud in years. The man who had disappeared from my life the day after that race, transferring to another school under circumstances I never fully understood, leaving me with nothing but the memory of his lips and the terrible knowledge that I had wanted him to kiss me again. 23 years. A marriage. 2 children, a mortgage and a reliable car, and all the markers of a life well lived. And still, standing there watching my son cross the finish line in second place, all I could think about was a boy with green eyes who had loved me enough to risk everything in a single, impossible moment. A boy who had seen something in me that I had spent decades trying not to see in myself. The boy who had never really left the shadows of my memory, no matter how hard I tried to convince myself he had. The drive home from the track took me through the carefully manicured streets of Elmhurst, a suburb that had been my home for the past 15 years. Tree-lined avenues with sidewalks that never cracked, lawns that stayed green well into October, houses that looked like they had been designed by committee to offend no one and inspire nothing. My neighborhood was the kind of place where people moved when they wanted their lives to become predictable, when the wild possibilities of youth had been traded for the comfort of knowing exactly what each day would bring. I pulled into the driveway of our colonial revival, a house that Clara had fallen in love with the moment she saw the bay windows and the wraparound porch. She had stood in the empty living room during our first walkthrough, her hands pressed together like she was praying, and told me she could see our whole future here. Christmas mornings with children opening presents by the fireplace, birthday parties in the backyard, quiet evenings reading books in the study while rain drummed against the windows. She had been right about all of it, and yet somehow none of it felt like mine. The front hallway was lined with photographs in matching frames, a timeline of our family that Clara updated religiously. David's first steps, Emma's piano recital, our anniversary dinner at that restaurant downtown where the waiters wore bow ties and spoke in hushed tones. Vacation photos from places we had visited because other families visited them. Beach houses and mountain cabins and theme parks where we had smiled for the camera and created memories that looked exactly like memories were supposed to look. Clara was in the kitchen when I walked in, her blonde hair pulled back in the same ponytail she had worn since college, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she scrolled through her tablet. She looked up when she heard my footsteps, and her smile was warm and automatic, the kind of expression that comes from 20 years of practiced affection. "How did David do?" she asked, not looking up from whatever article she was reading about organic gardening or school board elections or the latest child safety recommendations. I told her he came in second, and she made the appropriate sounds of encouragement and pride. She said we should take him out for ice cream to celebrate, that it would be good for him to know we were proud regardless of whether he won or lost. Everything she said was reasonable and kind and exactly what a good mother should say. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, watching her read. 20 years of marriage had settled into this rhythm of pleasant parallel existence. We shared a house, a bed, a checking account, 2 children, and countless small decisions about grocery lists and school schedules and whose turn it was to take the car in for an oil change. But we rarely looked at each other anymore, not really. Not the way we had when we were young and still believed that love meant never running out of things to say. The truth was that Clara was everything a man like me was supposed to want. She was intelligent without being threatening, beautiful in a wholesome way that aged gracefully, devoted to our children, active in the community. She volunteered at the library and organized the neighborhood book club and remembered to send birthday cards to relatives I had forgotten existed. She was steady and reliable and kind, and I had built my entire adult life around the safety of her constancy. But constancy, I was learning, could feel an awful lot like suffocation. David came home an hour later, his hair still damp from the shower, his track bag slung over one shoulder. He was proud of his second-place finish but trying not to show it, the way teenage boys do when they want to seem like they don't care about anything. He ate dinner with the focused intensity of someone who had spent the afternoon pushing his body to its limits, and I watched him shovel pasta into his mouth and tried to remember what it felt like to be that hungry, that alive, that certain that tomorrow's race might be the one that changed everything. Emma practiced piano in the living room after dinner, her small fingers working through a Bach invention with determined precision. She was 12, serious and careful about everything she did, the kind of child who colored inside the lines and turned in her homework early and worried about disappointing people she had never met. The music drifted through the house like a soundtrack to our evening routine, each note perfectly placed, technically correct, beautiful in its precision, and somehow heartbreaking in its complete lack of spontaneity. Clara read in bed beside me, her book propped against her knees, her breathing steady and content. I stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about the track meet, about the way my pulse had quickened when David rounded that final turn, about the memory that had grabbed me by the throat and refused to let go. But Elias was there in the darkness behind my eyelids, 23 years old forever, his chest heaving as he leaned in to kiss me in front of a crowd that might have been watching, might have seen everything, might have understood what I was too terrified to understand myself. I had been a different person then, not just younger, but fundamentally different, as if the man I had become was wearing the skin of someone who had died on that track the day after Elias transferred schools. Running had been everything to me in those days. Not just the physical act of moving my body through space faster than physics said I should be able to, but the purity of it. The way it stripped everything else away until there was nothing left but breath and heartbeat, and the desperate need to reach whatever waited beyond the finish line. Elias had understood that. More than understood it. He had shared it. Our rivalry had been the kind of thing that poets write about and coaches dream of. Two boys pushing each other beyond the boundaries of what either could have achieved alone. We had trained together, eaten together, studied together, spent so many hours in each other's company that people started making jokes about us being joined at the hip. But we never talked about the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, or the way my skin felt electric whenever he accidentally brushed against me, or the dreams I had started having where we were running together through landscapes that had nothing to do with any track I had ever seen. Now I sold insurance and drove a sedan and attended parent-teacher conferences and pretended that the most important decisions I had to make were about term life versus whole life policies. I had built a life that was safe and predictable and utterly, devastatingly ordinary. A life where I was a ghost haunting my own existence, going through the motions of being a husband and father and responsible member of society, while some essential part of me remained frozen on that track, waiting for a kiss that had lasted 3 seconds and changed everything. Clara shifted beside me, reaching over to turn off her reading light. She kissed my cheek goodnight, her lips dry and familiar against my skin, and settled into sleep with the easy conscience of someone who had never spent 20 years wondering what might have happened if she had been brave enough to choose differently. I lay awake until the numbers on the alarm clock turned red and angry, and tried to remember the last time I had felt truly, completely alive. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, buried between notifications about David's upcoming parent-teacher conference and a reminder that our homeowner's insurance was up for renewal. I almost deleted it without reading it. The subject line was generic enough: Alumni Athletics Reunion, Northwestern Class of 2002. The kind of message that usually meant someone wanted money or was trying to recapture glory days that probably weren't as glorious as memory insisted they had been. But something made me hesitate, my finger hovering over the delete button. Maybe it was the restless energy that had been building in my chest since the track meet 3 days earlier, or maybe it was the simple fact that I had been thinking about running more in the past week than I had in the past decade. Either way, I opened it. The message was exactly what I expected: cheerful and corporate, full of exclamation points and carefully crafted nostalgia. There would be a banquet dinner at the University Club downtown. Speeches from former coaches who were probably emeritus now, their hair gone gray and their voices hoarse from decades of shouting at young people to run faster. Photo displays of championship teams and record holders. An open bar and the kind of rubbery chicken that gets served at events where the food is an afterthought to the networking. I was already mentally composing my polite decline when I scrolled down to the bottom of the message. The organizing committee was listed there in small print, names I vaguely remembered from teammates and competitors who had probably become accountants and sales managers and high school coaches. Names that meant nothing to me now, faces I could barely recall. And then I saw it. Elias Carter, events coordinator. The name hit me like a physical blow, so sudden and unexpected that I actually gasped. My coffee mug slipped from my fingers and shattered against the kitchen floor, sending ceramic shards and lukewarm coffee across the tiles. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the screen, reading and rereading those two words until they stopped looking like letters and became something else entirely. A key, a door, a bridge across 23 years of careful forgetting. Elias Carter. I hadn't spoken that name aloud in years. Hadn't even allowed myself to think it most of the time, except in those unguarded moments just before sleep when the defenses I had built around my memory started to crumble. But there it was, printed in Times New Roman like it was just another name on just another committee for just another alumni event. As if those two words didn't contain the power to unravel everything I had spent decades constructing. I cleaned up the broken mug mechanically, my hands shaking slightly as I swept the pieces into the dustpan. Clara would ask about it when she got home from her book club meeting. She would want to know how I had managed to break our favorite coffee mug, the one with the Northwestern logo that we had bought during our first visit to campus together. I would tell her it slipped, which was true enough. I wouldn't tell her why. That night, after Clara had kissed me goodnight and settled into sleep, I lay in the darkness and tried to make sense of what I was feeling. It wasn't just surprise, though I was certainly surprised. Elias had vanished from my life so completely after transferring schools that I had sometimes wondered if I had imagined him entirely. But here was proof that he existed, that he had continued living and working and organizing alumni events while I had been building my carefully ordered life in the suburbs. The reunion was still 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to decide whether I was brave enough to walk into a room where he might be standing. 3 weeks to imagine what he looked like now, whether his dark hair had gone gray at the temples, whether his green eyes still held that intensity that had made me feel like he could see straight through me to parts of myself I didn't even know existed. I had questions I had never been able to ask. Why had he transferred so suddenly, disappearing without explanation the day after that race? Had that kiss meant something to him? Or had it just been adrenaline and exhaustion and the strange intimacy that comes from pushing your body beyond its limits? Had he thought about me over the years? Or had I been just another competitor, easily forgotten once he moved on to new tracks and new rivalries? The sensible thing would be to ignore the invitation, to continue living the life I had built, the life that worked perfectly well as long as I didn't examine it too closely. Clara would never know I had even received the email. David and Emma would continue their own lives, their piano lessons and track practices and homework assignments, blissfully unaware that their father was wrestling with ghosts. But as the days passed, the reunion became an obsession I couldn't shake. I found myself checking the university's website, looking for recent photos of the track team, as if I might catch a glimpse of Elias in the background of some candid shot. I drove past the old campus one afternoon when I should have been making sales calls, parking across from the athletics building and staring at the windows like a stalker. I invented a dozen excuses not to go. Work obligations that I could easily reschedule. Family commitments that didn't really exist. The simple fact that reunions were generally terrible, full of forced conversations with people you had never really known in the first place. But every excuse felt hollow, a transparent attempt to protect myself from something I wasn't even sure I was afraid of. The truth was that some part of me had never stopped waiting for him to come back. 23 years of marriage and career and parenthood, and I was still that 23-year-old boy standing on a track, breathless and confused and desperate to understand what had just happened between us. I had built an entire life around the assumption that whatever I had felt for Elias was a phase, a temporary madness brought on by youth and competition and the strange chemistry that sometimes develops between rivals. But the email had awakened something in me that felt anything but temporary. 2 weeks before the reunion, I printed out the invitation and carried it with me everywhere, folded into quarters and tucked into my wallet like a love letter. I would pull it out during lunch breaks and slow traffic, reading it over and over until the words were memorized. The University Club. Saturday evening. Cocktails at 6, dinner at 7. Business casual attire recommended. 1 week before, I went shopping for a new shirt, something I hadn't done for anything other than work in years. I stood in the fitting room at the department store, looking at myself in the three-way mirror, and tried to imagine what Elias would see when he looked at me. The lines around my eyes, the gray creeping into my hair at the temples, the softness around my middle that came from 20 years of desk work instead of daily training. I looked like what I was, a middle-aged man who had traded possibility for security and was only now beginning to wonder what that trade had cost him. The night before the reunion, I lay awake until 3 in the morning, listening to Clara's steady breathing and trying to convince myself that I was making a mistake, that some doors were meant to stay closed, some chapters were meant to remain unfinished, that the life I had built was good enough, even if it wasn't the life I had once imagined for myself. But when the sun came up and Clara left for her Saturday morning yoga class, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, the cursor blinking in the RSVP field. My hands were trembling as I typed my name, selected the chicken dinner option, and clicked submit. The confirmation email arrived instantly, as if the universe had been waiting for me to finally make up my mind. Julian Mercer, 1 attendee. Table assignment to be determined. I closed the laptop and sat in the sudden silence of my empty house, surrounded by the evidence of the life I had chosen and the photographs of the family I loved. But for the first time in years, I felt something stirring in my chest that might have been anticipation, or terror, or the terrible, wonderful possibility that some stories don't end where we think they do. I stood in the parking lot of the university club for 10 minutes before I found the courage to walk through the front doors. The building was all red brick and ivy, the kind of place that existed to make people feel important while they ate overpriced food and made small talk about stock portfolios and vacation homes. Through the tall windows, I could see figures moving around inside, men in navy blazers and women in cocktail dresses, everyone performing the careful dance of middle-aged people trying to prove they had turned out exactly as successful as they had always planned to be. My reflection stared back at me from the glass doors, and for a moment I didn't recognize myself. The new shirt I had bought fit well enough, but it couldn't disguise the fact that I looked like what I was, a man who had spent 20 years in conference rooms instead of on running tracks. I had tried to do something with my hair that morning, but it still looked like the hair of someone who got it cut at the same chain salon every 6 weeks and never asked for anything more adventurous than a trim. The ballroom buzzed with the particular energy of people who hadn't seen each other in decades, voices pitched slightly too high with forced enthusiasm, laughter that carried the weight of trying too hard. Name tags were scattered across a registration table, each one bearing a photograph from our college yearbook that made everyone look impossibly young and optimistic. I found mine and peeled off the backing, pressing it to my chest like a badge of courage. I accepted a glass of wine from a server who couldn't have been much older than David and tried to blend into the crowd. The conversations around me followed predictable patterns. Career updates delivered with carefully calibrated modesty. Stories about children who were inevitably exceptional. Health scares survived and vacation destinations conquered. Everyone looked older but not necessarily wiser, as if the years had simply accumulated like sediment without fundamentally changing who they were underneath. I was listening to a former teammate describe his daughter's acceptance to medical school when I saw him. Time collapsed. 23 years compressed into nothing, and suddenly I was 23 years old again, standing at the edge of a track with my heart hammering against my ribs. Elias was near the back of the room, holding a glass of what looked like water, his dark hair now touched with silver at the temples but still thick, still falling across his forehead in the same way it had when we were boys. He was wearing a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, and he looked older but unmistakably himself, as if some essential quality in him had remained untouched by the passage of time. He was listening to an older man I recognized as Coach Morrison, nodding at something being said, but his eyes were scanning the room with the same intensity one remembered, searching. And then, as if he could feel me watching him, he looked directly at me. The world stopped. 23 years of careful distance evaporated in the space of a heartbeat. His face went very still, and I watched him excuse himself from his conversation and begin moving through the crowd toward me. Each step he took felt like a small earthquake, shifting the foundations of everything I had built my life upon. "Hello, Julian," he said when he reached me, and his voice was exactly the same, low and careful, as if every word had to be weighed before it could be spoken. His green eyes held mine for a moment longer than was strictly polite, and I felt something electric pass between us, the same current that had always existed whenever we were in the same room together. "Elias," I managed, and was grateful that my voice sounded steadier than I felt. "You look good," which was inadequate and true and completely beside the point, but it was all I could think to say. The conversation that followed was painful in its politeness. We talked about the weather, about how strange it felt to be back on campus, about the changes to the athletics program since we had graduated. He told me he was coaching high school track in Minnesota now, had been there for 8 years. I told him about the insurance business, about Clara and the kids, about our house in the suburbs with its 2-car garage and its carefully maintained lawn. But underneath the small talk, something else was happening. Every word felt loaded with meaning, every pause charged with the weight of everything we weren't saying. His eyes never left my face, and I found myself studying the lines around his eyes, the way his hands moved when he talked, the fact that he wasn't wearing a wedding ring. "Are you married?" I asked finally, when the conversation had lulled into one of those silences that could either be comfortable or devastating. "No," he said, and something in his expression shifted. "Never found the right person, I guess." The words hung between us like a challenge, and I felt my chest tighten with implications I wasn't ready to examine. Around us, the reunion continued its cheerful chaos, but we might as well have been standing in a bubble, isolated from everything and everyone else. "This is strange, isn't it?" he said after a moment, gesturing vaguely at the room around us. "All these people trying to prove they turned out fine." "Did you," I asked, "turn out fine?" He considered this, taking a sip of his water. "I teach kids to run fast," he said finally. "Some of them listen. Most of them don't. But every once in a while, you get one who really gets it, who understands that running isn't just about being faster than everyone else." "What's it about then?" I said, though I thought I already knew the answer. "Finding out who you really are when everything else falls away," he said, and his eyes met mine again. "When it's just you and your body and the thing you're chasing." The noise of the ballroom seemed to fade around us. I could feel my pulse quickening, not from exertion but from recognition. This was the Elias I remembered, the boy who had understood that running was a form of prayer, a way of touching something larger than yourself. "Do you want to get some air?" he asked, and I nodded before I could think better of it. We slipped out of the ballroom and into the cooler evening, following pathways I hadn't walked in decades. The campus had changed, new buildings rising where old ones had been torn down, but the bones of it remained the same. We walked without talking at first, our footsteps echoing off brick pathways, the sounds of the reunion fading behind us. "I remember this place," he said as we passed the old dormitory where we had both lived junior year. "Different floors, but the same building. I used to hear you coming back from late training runs. Your room was directly above mine. You never said anything," I said. "I was afraid if I did, you'd think I was watching you." Which I was. The admission hung in the air between us, simple and devastating. We kept walking, past the library where we had pretended to study together, past the dining hall where we had sat across from each other at countless meals, talking about times and training schedules, and everything except the way the space between us seemed to crackle with electricity. The track was darker now, lit only by scattered security lights that cast long shadows across the infield. We stood at the edge of the same oval where we had spent so many hours pushing each other to run faster, jump higher, throw farther. Where we had learned what our bodies were capable of when we stopped thinking and started trusting. "This is where it happened," Elias said quietly, and I knew exactly what he meant. "Where you kissed me." "Where you kissed me," I corrected, though the distinction felt less important now than it had 23 years ago. We walked down into the infield, our shoes crunching on the worn grass. In the daylight, with runners circling the track and coaches shouting instructions, this place had always felt electric with possibility. Now, in the darkness, it felt sacred. like a church where we had once worshipped something we didn't have names for. I've thought about that day so many times, Elias said, stopping near where the finish line would be. About what might have happened if I hadn't transferred. Why did you transfer? I asked. You never told me you were leaving. One day you were just gone. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the track. Because I was in love with you, he said finally. And I was 23 years old and terrified, and I didn't know what to do with that. So I ran. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because they were shocking, but because they weren't. Some part of me had always known, had always felt the pull between us that was stronger than competition, deeper than friendship. But hearing him say it out loud, 23 years too late, made something in my chest crack open. I've been running ever since, I said, though I wasn't sure if I meant it literally or metaphorically. From that moment, from what I felt, from who I might have been if I had been brave enough to stay and figure it out. We stood there in the darkness, two middle-aged men surrounded by the ghosts of who we used to be. The silence stretched between us, full of everything we had never said and everything we were still afraid to say. But for the first time in decades, I felt like I could breathe, like oxygen was finally reaching parts of my lungs that had been closed off for so long I had forgotten they existed. When Elias looked at me in the pale light from the security lamps, his expression was both familiar and devastating. It was the same way he had looked at me during training runs when we were boys, when we pushed each other past the point of exhaustion into something approaching transcendence. But now there was something else in his eyes, something that made my chest tight and my hands shake. Recognition, as if he had been waiting all these years for me to remember who I really was. We stood there in the darkness for what felt like hours, though it might have been minutes. The night air was cool against my skin, carrying the scent of cut grass and that particular smell of old rubber and sweat that clings to athletic facilities no matter how many years pass. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint hum of highway traffic, the endless movement of people going somewhere else, living their lives while mine hung suspended in this moment between past and present. I never stopped thinking about it, I said finally, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. About that day, about what happened after the race. My voice was shaking, decades of careful repression suddenly trembling in the air between us. I had never said those words aloud to anyone, had barely allowed myself to think them in the privacy of my own mind. But standing here in the place where it had happened, with Elias beside me looking exactly like himself, only older, it felt impossible to keep carrying the weight of that silence. The kiss, I continued, because I needed to name it, needed to make it real after all these years of pretending it might have been a dream. I've thought about it every day for 23 years. I've tried not to, but it's always there, like a song you can't get out of your head. Elias was very still beside me, listening without judgment, without the surprise or shock I had always imagined would greet this admission. When I finally found the courage to look at him, his expression was calm, almost relieved, as if he had been waiting decades for me to say exactly these words. I kissed you because I loved you, he said simply, and his voice was steady in a way that made my chest tight. I thought you knew. The words hit me like a physical blow, so simple and devastating that for a moment I couldn't breathe. All these years, I had told myself stories about that kiss, that it had been adrenaline, exhaustion, the strange intimacy that comes from pushing your body beyond its limits alongside someone who understands that particular form of madness. I had convinced myself it was an accident, a moment of confusion in the aftermath of the most important race of our college careers. But Elias was telling me it had been intentional, a declaration, a choice. You loved me, I repeated, testing the words, trying to understand how they changed everything I thought I knew about that day, about our rivalry, about the years that followed. I loved you, he confirmed. From the first day you showed up at practice and ran that time trial like you were being chased by demons. The way you threw yourself into every workout like it was life or death. The way you never gave up, even when your body was screaming at you to stop. He paused, looking out across the track that held so many of our memories. You ran like you were searching for something, he said. Like if you could just go fast enough, far enough, You might finally catch whatever it was you were chasing. I wanted to be part of that search. My world tilted. 23 years of careful forgetting, of building a life around the assumption that whatever I had felt for him was a phase, a temporary madness brought on by youth and competition. But he was telling me that our rivalry had been something else entirely. That all those hours we had spent pushing each other, all those training runs where we had talked about everything except the electricity that crackled between us, had been a form of intimacy I had been too afraid to recognize. I thought about our junior year, when we had started meeting for early morning runs before official practice began. How we would slip out of our dorm rooms while everyone else was still sleeping and meet on the steps of the athletics building as the sun was rising. Those runs had felt sacred to me. The two of us moving through the empty campus while the world was still quiet, our breathing synchronized, our strides matching without conscious effort. I had told myself we were just training partners, that the way my pulse quickened when I saw him lacing up his running shoes was just competitive excitement, that the dreams I started having where we were running together through landscapes that had nothing to do with any track I had ever seen were just my subconscious processing the intensity of our rivalry. But now, standing in the darkness where that kiss had happened, I could finally acknowledge what I had been too terrified to see then, that I had loved him too, that every morning run, every shared meal, every moment we spent in each other's company had been charged with a desire I didn't have names for, didn't have permission to feel. The rivalry wasn't just competition, I said, understanding flooding through me like cold water. It was how we touched each other without touching, how we said things we couldn't say any other way. Elias nodded, and in the pale light from the security lamps, I could see something that might have been relief in his expression. Every time we raced against each other, every time we pushed each other past what we thought was possible, it was like a conversation we couldn't have any other way. I remembered the way he used to look at me during those races, his green eyes fierce with concentration, but also with something else, something I had been too young and too afraid to name. The way he would push himself beyond exhaustion to stay with me, stride for stride, as if letting me win would have been a betrayal of something larger than competition. That's why I transferred, he said quietly, because I knew if I stayed, I would have told you how I felt. And in 2002, in that place, with the lives we were supposed to be building, I didn't think you could handle that truth. I didn't think either of us could. He was right, of course. In 2002, I had been 23 years old and terrified of anything that didn't fit into the narrow definition of who I was supposed to become. I had already started dating Clara, had already begun building the framework of the life I thought I wanted. Safe, predictable, socially acceptable. The idea that I might be in love with my training partner, that our rivalry might be a cover for something deeper and more dangerous, would have shattered everything I thought I knew about myself. But that kiss had planted a seed that no amount of careful forgetting could kill. For 23 years, it had lived in the shadows of my memory, growing quietly, patiently, waiting for a moment like this when I was finally ready to acknowledge what it had always been. I loved you too, I said, and the words felt like a confession and a revelation and a prayer all at once. I was just too afraid to know it. The silence that followed was different from any silence I had ever experienced. Not empty, but full. Full of recognition and grief and the terrible, wonderful weight of finally speaking a truth that had been waiting decades to be heard. Standing there in the place where our story had begun and ended and was now beginning again, I felt something shift inside my chest, like a door that had been locked for so long I had forgotten it existed finally swinging open. For the first time in 23 years, I felt like I could breathe. I drove home through the empty suburban streets at 2 in the morning, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The reunion had ended hours ago, but Elias and I had stayed on that track until the security guard found us and politely suggested we move along. Even then, we had walked slowly back to the parking lot, neither of us ready to break the spell that had settled over us in the darkness. We had exchanged phone numbers like teenagers, fumbling with our phones in the pale light of the street lamps. His fingers had brushed mine when he handed my phone back, and the contact had sent electricity up my arm. Such a small thing, But after 23 years of careful distance, it felt monumental. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. Clara had left the porch light on for me, the way she always did when I was out late, and I sat in the car for a long moment staring at that yellow glow. It looked like safety, like the life I had built, reliable and predictable and completely separate from the earthquake that had just shifted the ground beneath my feet. I slipped into the bedroom as quietly as I could, but Clara stirred when I closed the bathroom door. "How was it?" she mumbled into her pillow. "The reunion." "Fine," I said, which was both completely true and utterly inadequate. It was fine, but nothing was fine. Nothing would ever be fine again, not in the way it had been before I saw Elias standing in that ballroom, before he told me he had loved me, before I admitted the truth I had been carrying for more than half my life. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what came next. The days that followed were a special kind of torture. I went through the motions of my normal routine, driving to work, sitting through meetings, coming home to family dinners where Clara asked about my day and David complained about his chemistry teacher and Emma practiced piano in the living room. But I felt like I was watching it all through glass, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. Clara noticed first. She had always been perceptive, tuned in to the subtle changes in mood and energy that come from 20 years of marriage. She started asking if I was feeling okay, if something was wrong at work, if I wanted to talk about whatever was bothering me. I deflected every question with practiced ease, but I could see the concern growing in her eyes. Elias and I began texting. Carefully at first, simple messages about how strange it had been to see each other again, how surreal the whole evening had felt. But gradually the conversations deepened. He told me about his life in Minnesota, about the kids he coached who reminded him of us at that age, about the loneliness of living in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. I told him about the insurance business, about David's track meets and Emma's piano recitals, about the way I sometimes felt like I was sleepwalking through my own existence. We met for coffee 3 weeks after the reunion. I told Clara I was meeting an old college friend who was passing through town, which was true enough to ease my conscience, but vague enough to avoid questions I wasn't ready to answer. We chose a place downtown, far from my usual haunts, where the chances of running into someone I knew were minimal. Seeing him in daylight, in a normal setting with other people around us, should have made the whole thing feel less significant. But if anything, it made it more real. He looked tired, older than he had in the romantic lighting of that evening at the track, but his presence still had the same effect on me. My pulse quickened the moment he walked through the door. My skin felt electric when he sat down across from me. We talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing, about his students and my children, about books we had read and places we wanted to travel, about the ways our bodies had changed since we stopped running competitively, about the small aches and pains that come with middle age. Normal conversation between old friends, except for the undercurrent of electricity that ran beneath every word. When I got up to leave, he touched my hand briefly, so quickly that anyone watching would have missed it. But I felt that touch for the rest of the day, a warm spot on my skin that reminded me I was still capable of feeling something other than the comfortable numbness I had settled into. "This can't keep happening," I told him when we met again the following week, this time at a bookstore cafe where we could hide among the stacks and speak in whispers. "I have a family, a life." "Do you?" he asked quietly, and the question hit me like a slap. "Do you have a life? Or are you just living someone else's idea of what your life should look like?" The truth of it was devastating. I had built a life that looked perfect from the outside, that checked all the boxes of middle-class respectability, but I had somehow forgotten to include myself in it. I was a husband who rarely touched his wife, a father who loved his children but felt like a stranger to them, a man who had spent decades performing the role of someone I wasn't sure I had ever really been. "Are you willing to stop living half a life?" Elias asked me during our third meeting, and his green eyes held mine with the same intensity one remembered from our racing days. "Because that's what this is, Julian. What we've both been doing. Living half-lives." That night, Clara confronted me in the kitchen while I was loading the dishwasher. She had been watching me for weeks, cataloging the small changes in my behavior, the way I checked my phone constantly, the way I seemed to be somewhere else even when I was standing right in front of her. "You're somewhere else lately," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Where is it?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. I could have deflected again, made up some story about work stress or midlife anxiety. But looking at her standing there in her pajamas, her blonde hair falling around her shoulders, her blue eyes full of the kind of patient concern that came from 20 years of trying to understand me, I realized I couldn't lie anymore. Not to her, and not to myself. The truth trembled in my chest like a bird trapped in a cage, desperate to fly free. But I couldn't open my mouth to release it. Not yet. Not when I didn't know what it would cost us both. "I don't know," I said finally, which was both a lie and the most honest thing I had said to her in months. "I'm sorry. I just need some time to figure things out." She studied my face for a long moment, and I could see her making calculations, weighing the evidence of my distance against the history of our marriage. Finally, she nodded, but her expression was guarded in a way I had never seen before. "Okay," she said, "but Julian, whatever you're figuring out, don't take too long. We can't live like this indefinitely." After she went to bed, I sat in my study surrounded by the books I had never read and the awards I had never cared about, staring at my phone and the number I had memorized but hadn't yet had the courage to call. The choice was crystallizing in front of me with terrifying clarity. I could continue living the life I had built, safe and predictable and slowly suffocating. Or I could step into the unknown, toward a love that was 23 years too late, but somehow still felt like the most real thing I had ever encountered. Either way, something would have to die. Either the man I had been pretending to be, or the man I might have become if I had been brave enough to choose differently all those years ago. The question was which death I could live with, and which one would kill me. The kitchen was quiet in the hour before dawn, that sacred time when the world holds its breath between night and morning. I sat at the table where we had eaten thousands of meals together, where David had done his homework and Emma had practiced her scales on imaginary piano keys, where Clara and I had planned vacations and discussed mortgage refinancing and argued about whose turn it was to drive carpool. On the counter in front of me sat two objects that held the weight of my entire life: my wedding ring, a simple gold band that had circled my finger for 20 years, and an envelope addressed to Clara in my careful handwriting. The letter inside had taken me all night to write, each word extracted from some deep place I had forgotten existed. I had started over 7 times, crumpling page after page until the wastebasket overflowed with failed attempts to explain the unexplainable. How do you tell someone you love that you are leaving them for a truth you should have embraced decades ago? How do you apologize for 20 years of living as half a person, for giving them only the pieces of yourself that felt safe, acceptable, manageable? How do you make them understand that this isn't about them, isn't about failure or inadequacy, but about finally having the courage to stop running from who you really are? The letter was honest in a way I had never been, not with Clara, not with myself. I told her about Elias, about the kiss that had haunted me for 23 years, about the love I had buried so deep I had almost convinced myself it didn't exist. I told her about the mornings I woke up feeling like I was suffocating in our bed, about the way I had to remind myself to touch her, about the terrible hollowness of going through the motions of a life that belonged to someone else. I told her she deserved better. Someone who could love her completely, without reservation, without the shadow of another person standing between them. Someone who didn't have to work so hard to be present in his own existence. The hardest part was writing about David and Emma. How do you explain to children that their father is leaving not because he doesn't love them, but because he loves them enough to finally stop lying about who he is? That he wants them to grow up knowing it's possible to live authentically, even when it's terrifying, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. I sealed the envelope and placed it back on the counter next to my wedding ring. Such small objects to hold such enormous weight. 20 years of marriage reduced to a circle of gold and 3 pages of handwritten explanation. My suitcase waited by the back door, packed with the essentials of a life I was choosing to begin at 46. Not much, really. some clothes, a few books, the photograph of Elias and me from our senior year track team that I had hidden in my office desk drawer for 2 decades. I was leaving almost everything behind, but for the first time in years, it felt like I was moving towards something instead of away from it. I stepped outside into the cool morning air, my breath visible in small puffs of vapor. The sun was just beginning to edge above the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pale gold and pink. Our neighborhood was still asleep, houses dark and silent, the only sound the distant hum of early commuters on the highway beyond the trees. My heart was pounding, but not with panic. This wasn't the desperate sprint of someone running from disaster. This was something else entirely. The steady, purposeful rhythm of someone who had finally found their pace, who knew exactly where they were headed and why. I thought about David, still asleep upstairs, probably dreaming about his next race, about the college scouts who had started paying attention to his times. I hoped someday he would understand that courage wasn't about winning or being faster than everyone else. It was about being willing to run toward your truth, even when the path was uncertain, even when you couldn't see the finish line. I thought about Emma, who would wake up in a few hours and practice her piano with the same methodical dedication she brought to everything in her life. I hoped she would learn that perfection wasn't about playing every note correctly, but about playing with your whole heart, about being willing to risk a wrong note for the sake of genuine expression. I thought about Clara, who would find my letter in a few hours and have to rebuild her understanding of who we had been together, who she was without me. I hoped she would forgive me eventually, not for leaving, but for staying so long when I couldn't give her what she deserved. And I thought about Elias, waiting for me in a small town 3 states away, probably awake too, probably watching his own sunrise and wondering if I would have the courage to choose love over safety, truth over comfort, authentic life over acceptable performance. I picked up my suitcase and walked down the driveway, my steps unhurried, deliberate. This wasn't an escape. This was a homecoming. For the first time in 23 years, I was running toward myself instead of away from who I was afraid to be. Behind me, the house I had called home for 15 years grew smaller in my peripheral vision. Ahead of me, the sun climbed higher into a sky that seemed wider than it had ever been before, full of possibilities I was finally brave enough to embrace. I reached the sidewalk and turned left, toward the train station, toward the life I should have chosen long ago, toward the man who had been patient enough to wait for me to find my way back to the truth of who I was. My heart kept its steady rhythm, the sound of someone who had finally, after all these years, crossed the finish line that mattered most.